I wish you good afternoon. Thanks for joining us. My name's Paul Anderson. I'm the Executive Director at the Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries, and I welcome you to our monthly Lunch and Learn talk series. Today's topic is offshore wind energy in the Gulf of Maine, and in particular, the process for developing a roadmap to the future. We have a panel of four experts that are participating in the roadmap process. And I'll introduce them in just a moment. A few welcome comments. We at Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries are based in Stonington. We work on primarily commercial fisheries, but also the seafood sector at large, aquaculture and other parts of the industry, mostly focused in Eastern Maine, but the work we do on ecosystem approaches really is a global kind of an approach to what we hope is better information and better management for our fisheries, our coasts, and the communities that depend on them. Today's topic is complex, and with complexity comes concern and controversy. So no doubt you'll be provoked to have some questions, and I hope we help to inform you as you think about this issue and how it affects you and the people around you. The topic of offshore wind has been emerging for a long time. Ethan Tremblay, who's with us, will set the table on some of the backstory as we go into this conversation about the roadmap. But I've been involved with this a bit in my career too over the last 10 or more years. And so right now, just to be clear, I see there's three pieces that are happening right now around us here on the coast of Maine. One is a research project involving one turbine off the coast of Monhegan, Maine, and that's with the University of Maine's research program in partnership with the Maine Aqua Ventus. They anticipate putting that one turbine in sometime in 2024, I believe. A second thing that's been emerging over the last year or more is a proposal from the state to create an offshore wind energy research array. And this would be an area of the coast in federal waters, probably off the southern Maine coast, and a proposal has been put into the Bureau of Oceans and Energy Management of the federal government, requesting permission to do that. That decision is pending, and that proposal was submitted, I think, earlier this year. The thing we're talking about today is a third piece that's happening simultaneously, and that's a planning effort, a couple of years funded by the US EDA to develop an offshore energy wind energy roadmap. And that's what you're here to learn about today. I happen to sit on one of the working groups, and Karl Wilson is with us to present the work from the fisheries working group. I've been on this since it started back in the fall, I think. It's co-chaired by Captain Terry Alexander, fisherman out of southern Maine, and Deputy Commissioner of DMR Meredith Mendelson. He meets monthly. Since last fall, as I said, there's a lot of good fishermen involved, a lot of good discussions going on in that. And the outcome of that work over these months is what Karl will be presenting to you. In my opinion, I think the state and the facilitators involved are doing a really good job of working our way through these complex issues in those settings, even though we're stuck on Zooms all the time. So today we're going to hear the draft recommendations from each of these four working groups, and I'm hoping we can go through these sequentially. Each of our guests have a short PowerPoint slide deck that they'll present. You can import your questions anytime in the chat or in the Q&A function of your screen. And if we are all on time, we'll find 15 or more minutes at the end of the hour to go through those questions as quickly as we can. So I appreciate your patience with that. We had a lot of people interested in this event today, and I welcome you all, and I'm glad you're here, but we only have an hour, so we'll see how far we get. The state does want to get feedback on these recommendations, and I think Ethan will be giving us information on how you can follow up this webinar with providing feedback to the Governor's Energy Office. So with that, I'm just going to introduce. You'll first hear from Ethan Tremblay, who's an energy analyst from the Governor's Energy Office. And he is participating in the Energy Markets and Strategies Working Group. Then Karl Wilson, the leader of the Bureau of Science for the Department of Marine Resources, will provide a summary of the recommendations from the Fisheries Working Group. Karl will be followed by Dr. Wing Goodale, who's the Senior Research Director at the Biodiversity Research Institute. And he is presenting on the Environment and Wildlife Working Group. And the final working group is Supply Chain, Workforce, Ports, and Marine Transportation. It's kind of a big catch-all. And those recommendations will be presented by Josh Rosen, who's here with us, and he's an offshore wind consultant working with the Maine International Trade Center. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Ethan and we'll get started.
Paul, thanks so much. And thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and hope that I get the thumbs up from someone that you're seeing what I'm intending to show you. Paul, looks good. All right, so thank you. What I'd like to do today is, so I will be presenting the initial draft recommendations from the Energy Markets and Strategies Working Group, which is one of the 4 working groups under the Maine Offshore Wind Roadmap process that Paul has just given a great overview of. Before I get into those recommendations, I also want to give some overarching context, both what the state is doing, what's happening with offshore wind regionally and around the world, and then why it's happening. And the context really, as we jump into this, is Maine's climate goals. So that's the first thing that I want to talk about. What are Maine's climate goals? So in 2019, Governor Mills signed bipartisan legislation, multiple bills that did several things. One is require that Maine reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. So this is CO2 equivalents 45% below 1990 levels by 2030, and then a total of 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. The impetus for this is really to reduce the impact that we are having as a state on climate change. Governor Mills also signed an executive order directing the state to achieve carbon neutrality by 2045. To achieve these goals, Governor Mills also signed bipartisan legislation which established the Maine Climate Council, which is a broad group of stakeholders from across the state with expertise in various areas that's charged with developing 4-year plans for climate action. So the first climate action plan for the state, called Maine Won't Wait, was released on December 1st of 2020. And it identifies strategies for the state to both achieve our greenhouse gas emission reduction requirements, as well as advance equity through our climate response, ensure that Maine people, industries, and communities are resilient to the impacts of climate change, and foster economic opportunity and prosperity. This is just to give you a quick summary of where Maine's greenhouse gas emissions come from. So the largest sector of greenhouse gas emissions is 54%, and that comes from transportation. This is primarily internal combustion engines in which we burn fossil fuels to move ourselves around. 19% come from the residential sector and 11% from commercial. This is primarily heating and cooling of buildings. We're heating our buildings. Maine is the most heating oil dependent state in the nation. About 2/3 of our households dependent on heating oil to keep us warm in the winter. 9% are from industrial and 7% from the generation of electric power. So the strategy that one of the sort of overarching strategies that Maine Won't Wait identifies to reduce these emissions is what we call beneficial electrification. I'll get to that in just a minute, but electrification is a key part of this. And so I want to talk about where we currently get our electricity in New England. So Maine is one of the 6 New England states that's a member of the ISO New England, which is the regional entity that coordinates transmission and generation markets. And I want to point out this chart shows 20 years of where Maine has gotten our electricity from, or where New England has gotten our electricity from, because we share a grid. A couple of key trends here. If you look in that bottom right corner, you'll see 20 years ago, we had about 1/3 of our power generation coming from coal and oil. That's down to below 1% now, although we still rely on many of those plants, particularly on the coldest winter days when we need natural gas to be diverted to heat buildings. At the top of the chart, you see that big blue wedge that's grown from 13% in 2000 to 40% today. That is natural gas. That is the single largest source of electricity in New England. We are over-dependent on natural gas to generate our electricity. And this is not only a significant source of emissions and key to reduce as we electrify more of our economy, but it also exposes us to the price volatility as a result of supply chain shortages, limited infrastructure to import natural gas into the region, and global instability like we're seeing, unfortunately, right now. So this is the single largest driver, even of recent electricity price increases in the state, is our over-reliance on natural gas. This is a projection of how much electricity Maine will need as we approach 2050. So this is key. As I mentioned a minute ago, one of our climate strategies is beneficial electrification. So this is transferring from high emitting technologies like internal combustion engines in the transportation sector or boilers and furnaces that use heating oil, kerosene, propane, and other fossil fuels in our homes and businesses, transferring to more efficient electrified technologies. So things like heat pumps, electric vehicles, and plug-in hybrids. And as we make that transition to electrification, not only are we more efficient with the energy that we use, we lose less as heat that is lost in engines and out the tailpipe. And we also ultimately need more electricity than we're using today in order to power these more efficient electrified technologies. So this is a projection that was performed for the Maine Climate Council as part of developing Maine Won't Wait. And it shows generally that Maine will need a little more than twice as much electricity in 2050 as we use today. So at the same time that we need more electricity, we also need to make sure that we're generating that electricity with renewable sources. In fact, the state has a law requiring us to have 80% of our electricity come from renewable sources by 2030 and a goal of 100% by 2050. So the key question here is, how can Maine meet these anticipated needs with clean energy sources? Last year, the Governor's Energy Office sponsored a study, the Renewable Energy Goals Market Assessment, which looked at this very question. It was focused on how we meet our 80% by 2030 requirement. So you see this box in the bottom right corner of that chart that says this study's focus, but it also had an eye towards 2050. And so just briefly, that blue wedge that you see is new investment in renewables that we need to meet our goals. This is, depending on the renewable energy technologies used, this is 800 to some thousands of megawatts of new capacity. The good news is we're on track to meet those goals through 2030. So where does offshore wind fit in? Offshore wind is growing both in the United States, down the Atlantic coast, and also around the world. So this is just a summary from the National Renewable Energy Lab, showing the more than 30 areas on the Atlantic coast where there's offshore wind activity. This is everything from wind energy area identification, where leases are being considered, all the way to projects that are already operational, like Block Island in Rhode Island and off Virginia. There are also earlier stage identifications on the West Coast. You can see California on the bottom left there and Hawaii in the top left of the chart. So as of today, states in the US have mandates requiring them to pursue offshore wind, totaling at least 39 gigawatts by 2030. And that pipeline is expected to continue to grow. This is a graphic released by the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, BOEM, which is a bureau in the Department of Interior, which is responsible for leasing federal parts of the continental shelf in federal waters for energy exploration. So that historically often has been oil and gas, and as offshore wind grows, that is a focus as well. So the federal government has set a goal of deploying 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030 to create nearly 80,000 jobs. And at the bottom here, we see different regions, including the New York Bight. You may have heard about leases that were just issued there a few weeks ago. Others down the Atlantic coast and on the West Coast. And at the very bottom is the Gulf of Maine, which BOEM has identified as an area where they will be identifying potential wind areas in 2023 and anticipating lease sales in 2024. For a bit of a global picture, just as an example, this is Scotland. So these green areas that you see off the coast of Scotland are recent leases awarded by the Crown Estate. These are for additional offshore wind development. 65% of the 25 gigawatts. So these green areas total to about 25 gigawatts of wind potential. And about 2/3 of that potential that was just leased is expected to be floating technology. So similarly in the US, almost 2/3 of the offshore wind resource that's out there is in water depths greater than 60 meters, which suggests that floating technology is going to be needed in order to access that wind potential. So what's Maine doing? Well, recognizing the potential for offshore wind as a significant new economic opportunity for the state, as well as key to our fight against climate change and our need to harness renewable energy, and also recognizing the need to sustain Maine's maritime heritage, Governor Mills has launched the Maine Offshore Wind Initiative, which has multiple components. I'll touch on these really quickly before I get to these roadmap recommendations. The roadmap is a key part of the Maine Offshore Wind Initiative. There are 4 major components: planning and future investments, which include this roadmap, as well as studies of Maine ports that are underway, policy and legislation, some bipartisan bills enacted last year, research and innovation, including the Offshore Wind Research Array, which Paul mentioned a moment ago, and I'll show you a picture of in a second, as well as the Maine Offshore Wind Research Consortium in formation. And then regional, national, and international partnerships, including participation in BOEM's Gulf of Maine Task Force and the Regional Wildlife Science Entity, and then the state's membership in the National Offshore Wind Research and Development Consortium, Business Network for Offshore Wind, and a memorandum of understanding that was signed with the government of the United Kingdom a couple of years ago. So I'll breeze through these fairly quickly, but I'm happy to come back if there are questions. Paul mentioned this project in state waters off Monhegan, the New England Aqua Ventus single turbine. This is a partnership with the University of Maine. It's a project that's been underway for several years, is supported by US DOE funding, and is poised to be the first floating offshore wind turbine deployed in the US. There's also the floating offshore wind research array. So the state applied, it was actually just at the end of last year on October 1st, applied to the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management for a research lease. This would be up to 12 floating turbines in federal waters. The area that was applied for, you can see on this map, is about 24 miles south of Monhegan, 45 miles southeast of Portland, again in federal waters. So the idea of this research array is to help us understand what we need to know about the interactions of ecosystems with floating offshore wind energy. Now to the roadmap. So this is, as Paul mentioned, again, I'll breeze through this quickly because he gave a great introduction. This is led by the Governor's Energy Office with support from other state agencies. It's funded with a more than $2 million grant from the U.S. Economic Development Administration. There's an overarching advisory committee overseeing 4 technical working groups, which we're here to present initial draft recommendations from. It is an open and public process that prioritizes participation. I'll tell you some of the many ways to participate in just a minute here. But these working groups have been working in dozens of meetings over the past 9 or so months to put forward these initial draft recommendations. There's been participation from the public at those more than dozens of meetings. And now we're in a period on this timeline where we're seeking proactive engagement. So that's showing up to webinars like this and getting out into communities to talk to folks about these recommendations. So the first phase was to develop them. The second one now is refining them with public input. Then the third phase later this year will be to finalize the roadmap. And you can see these arrows, there's key opportunities for engagement at every step of the process. The thing I want you to take away from this slide, and I'll drop this in the chat as soon as I'm done talking so that you have the link, is at the bottom, maineoffshorewind.org. That's where you can go to review these recommendations that we're about to present to you today. Of course, we're happy to take questions and have a conversation now, but also through the end of next month, we're hoping that as many people as possible will share their thoughts on that website. There's a feedback form, so you can go there if you have reactions to anything you've heard today or anything else about offshore wind in Maine. We'd love to have that feedback. So you can give feedback yourself. You can do it multiple times, encourage others to go as well. And that will be available through the end of next month. So with all that background, I'll now jump into the Energy Markets and Strategies Working Group recommendations. There are 3 initial draft recommendations from this working group. Given the context that we've just talked about the growth of offshore wind, the opportunity it presents for Maine, as well as the need to achieve our climate and renewable energy goals, the working group has reviewed multiple scenario analyses, and all of them show that Maine has multiple pathways to meet our renewable energy goals. The New England region is going to need offshore wind, and it's going to need offshore wind in the Gulf of Maine in order to meet its other states' renewable energy goals, as well as Maine's. So with that context in mind, the Energy Markets and Strategies Working Group is recommending that Maine establish and initiate an floating offshore wind requirement and procurement process. That process should be phased as the industry develops and as Maine's electricity needs grow. It should use competitive procurement processes, and it should involve a binding commitment from the state to signal our intent to pursue offshore wind. The second recommendation, building on the first, is to pursue policy and program designs to achieve cost-effective offshore wind deployment. So I didn't talk a lot about price projections, although the working group has reviewed them in depth. Overall, floating offshore wind is expected to drop in price by about 80% in the coming decades. And as we noted earlier, beneficial electrification does require us to shift to more electric consumption. So as costs fall and electricity prices increase, the working group is focused on making sure that we do this as cost effectively as possible. Finally, continuing to accelerate regional collaboration in support of offshore wind. So this could happen in multiple areas, including transmission and planning. It already is happening through entities like I mentioned earlier, like the Gulf of Maine Task Force through BOEM, as well as through entities like the New England States Committee on Electricity. Some examples of how this could take place would be allowing the Maine PUC to join other states in conducting procurements for offshore wind. So this is just the high level presentation of these recommendations. I'm happy to wrap up here and take questions once we're all through. And thank you again for everyone for being here today.
Thank you, Ethan. That was very helpful. A lot of good information there. Folks, in the chat, Laura Singer has already put that link for how you can provide input to these recommendations today. Karl, go ahead and share your screen. Karl Wilson, again, is the chief scientist for Maine DMR, runs the Bureau of Marine Science there. Close colleague with us. He's on our board of directors, and he's been attending the fisheries working group, and he'll present the findings to date of that group. Thanks for being here, Karl.
Hi, Paul, and thank you, and good to see everyone else virtually as well. So yeah, I work with the Department of Marine Resources. I lead our Bureau of Marine Science and was pretty heavily involved with drinking from the offshore wind fire hydrant last winter as we worked through some of the research array siting discussions. So it's a pleasure to be here. Just a little context. Maine fishing still matters. We have over 10,000 commercial harvesters, and their activities as measured by our landings program through the number of trips in a single year represent about 30% of all fishing trips on the eastern seaboard of the United States. So there's a significant stake here in this conversation about use of space. And so it's been some controversial, but really meaningful conversations over the last year and a half that we've been talking about this within the state. Maine, as many of you I'm sure are aware, has a long history of co-management with its fisheries. And what our fishermen and what we have found is that as we work through offshore wind development and discussions, this is not co-management of fisheries. This is a very different process. And people in Maine are used to working through the co-management process, and this is slightly different. And so everyone's kind of learning to adjust to that and find areas where input can be gathered in. And so this fisheries working group is one of these areas. And so just like to quickly go through the 11 recommendations, draft recommendations that are being put forward. And these recommendations are being driven directly from the fishermen that are participating within the fisheries working group, experience of scientific staff, managers, and members of the public as well. So just to go through these quickly, because I know that we have a limited amount of time, and I'm just going to blow through these. Communication. Some of these feel like a pretty common sense, but we need to develop clear lines of communication and engagement. It is sometimes hard to get the fishing industry to come to the table to participate if they don't feel that the communication engagement is there. So these were the recommendations 1 and 2. There is a tremendous amount of data that is needed for really proper siting of these sites. And so the working group is actively advocating for data accessibility and that any monitoring work around offshore development is robust and takes into account kind of not only the footprint of any development, but also expanding to surrounding areas in a kind of a control way. And then there's also a strong recommendation about research and providing an opportunity to actively seek out other funds to sustain some of this necessary research as well. Mapping, one of the things that we found last winter, we at the department, as we worked with the Governor's Energy Office on the research array, is that some fisheries are represented very well. Some wildlife characteristics, and Wayne will talk about this in a few minutes, are represented well, and then others, it's a complete black box. And so There's a recommendation to engage with fishermen, scientists, and other stakeholders with expertise in fisheries and wildlife. And this is really to help appropriately characterize high use and high value areas. Recommendation number 7 is a port access study. Request that the Coast Guard conduct a port access study to determine necessary formal and informal transit to fishing grounds and how much potential wind energy areas may adversely affect this transit. Port impacts assessment. If they're using certain ports for offshore wind support, what does that use and what are the implications of that use for the port's local economy and shoreside business? Recommendation number 9, avoid and minimize conflicts. So advocate for BOEM and any Gulf of Maine interagency task force to prohibit installation of offshore wind turbines within a distance from shore. This is still under consideration by the working group of what that would be. So a distance from shore based on activity. Recommendation 10, direct engagement in siting. Assist BOEM, Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, in providing active and direct engagement with Maine's fishing energy industry in the development of wind energy areas. And then finally, recommendation 11, state authorities. Assess existing state statutory and regulatory authorities related to the permitting of offshore wind turbines and transmission cables. And this is really through the equity lens of related to fisheries impact and take action to implement corrective actions around displacement activities. So other considerations would be around transmission, accountability, navigation and safety, construction and operations, regional coordination and collaboration, and then mitigation and compensation strategies. And then finally, the cumulative impacts of these separate but related development activities as well. And I believe that is my slide deck, Paul.
Thank you, Karl. That's a lot of information. I'll take a moment to let listeners know, viewers, that this webinar will be archived on our website where all of our webinars are. So if you want to revisit this at a later date, you'll certainly have access to these slides through the video. Thank you, Karl. We'll move on to the environment and wildlife recommendations. We have Dr. Wing Goodale with us today. Wing's a senior science director for the Biodiversity Research Institute and has been participating all along in this issue for quite a long time. And thanks for being here, Wing.
Yeah, thanks for having me. So let me very briefly, just like Karl, go through the work that we've been doing in the Environment Wildlife Working Group. I'm co-chair of this group along with John Perry with the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. And our group comprised a pretty diverse group of stakeholders here in Maine, representing state and federal environmental groups. We also have state and federal wildlife biologists as a part of this process, as well as universities engaged, as well as independent research entities. One thing that we've been doing, and has been very important from the beginning of this process, is to ensure that there are strong coordinations between the Environment and Wildlife Working Group and the Fisheries Working Group. And so that has been occurring both directly through making sure there's cross-pollination of ideas, but also Karl and Aaron have been, of DMR, have been part of both of the groups as well to make sure that there's strong coordination between the two. So very briefly, we have gone over that there's an opportunity here in Maine to move forward with offshore wind, but that it's very important that we develop recommendations and that the state of Maine has a voice in avoiding, minimizing, and mitigating potential impacts for projects in federal waters. These initial recommendations that I'm about to go through were presented to the advisory committee in January and represents half of the work that the group has been working on. And it's been really focused on sort of the avoidance piece of the conversation. Thought it might be helpful just to take a moment or two to talk about what are the potential effects that we focus on when we think about offshore wind and wildlife. And from the above water perspective, we're concerned about collision, but also avoidance that can lead to displacement from habitat. And for the most part, floating offshore wind is going to have similar types of responses of wildlife above water. Excuse me, I'm getting over a cold here. As you would have with traditional fixed bottom type projects. Now below water, it's going to be definitely some differences given that the floating technology is going to be anchored rather than affixed to the bottom. That is a positive from a potential effects during construction when you think about pile driving noise that can affect different types of wildlife and particularly large marine mammals as well as fisheries as well. One thing that we've seen in projects in Europe is that you're going to experience habitat change below water. With this new hard substrate that goes into the water, there's going to be fish aggregations, change of flow dynamics, and going to be changes in the seafloor around these projects. So those are the kind of things that we think about as we are thinking about offshore wind. So at this stage, we have 5 key recommendations. The first is to map existing data. And this is an important thing that's actually starting right now that we want to get going immediately so that the state can start to define areas where there might be greatest conflict between wildlife resources and offshore wind. And it's not necessarily saying where offshore wind should occur, but more focus on where it should not. The second is focus on collecting Gulf of Maine habitat data. The third is collect Gulf of Maine baseline information. The fourth is conduct tracking studies on particularly rare species. And then fifth is more of a policy regulatory recommendation focusing on the Coastal Zone Management Act and making sure that Maine is well situated to be able to engage in conversations with offshore projects. So dig a little deeper into this, each of these recommendations. So the first is map existing data to identify areas of greatest conflict between offshore wind energy development and wildlife. Now, one of the key things that has occurred during these discussions is that in a lot of cases, we have major data deficits and the data that we have is old or not, doesn't have equal effort across the Gulf of Maine. Also, when we try to predict the future, we need to recognize that the Gulf of Maine is changing due to climate change and that the data that we have from the past may not accurately predict the future. On the left, this is just an example of some abundance and distribution models for birds in the Gulf of Maine representing all species. So the areas that are yellow are representing areas of relatively higher use compared to the areas around them. So this is the idea is bring in multiple layers like this of existing models and data in order to try to understand these sort of higher conflict areas. One thing that will be important here is to integrate areas of high fishing use as well and not just be focused on environment and wildlife. And one thing that was really interesting during the sighting of the research array was that DMR and BRI did separate sort of processes looking at areas of greatest conflict from a fisheries and wildlife perspective. And when those two were brought together, we came up with almost the same exact areas that to avoid that avoided conflicts as much as possible. And part of that has to do with the strong drivers below water, such as bathymetry and upwelling areas in driving the overall productivity of the marine system. But given the uncertainty and lack of data that we have in many areas, this mapping process, which is just starting up, is going to include workshops with scientists and fisheries experts to really try to fill in those gaps of knowledge. And most importantly, this is going to be an iterative mapping process. So as new data comes in, we're able to update these maps. As we thought about mapping, it becomes very complex quickly on how do you make thresholds on areas that are more or less important. So one of the key things is we'll be focusing on foraging habitat for marine birds that have greater vulnerability to collision and displacement, migratory pathways, areas used by endangered species, areas with deep sea corals, spawning and feeding areas, and aggregations of high priority managed species and protected species, and areas of aggregation of Calanus. As we move into considering habitat data, this is me focused on benthic habitat surveys. As you can see on the map on the left, that much of the data that we have on benthic mapping is old, and it's also inconsistent in how it's been put together. So one of the first things that's been discussed here is to establish a Gulf of Maine marine mapping initiative in which all the existing data is brought together, and those working on this are bringing together in a coordinated effort. Second is start to fill in holes with collecting high resolution multi-beam mapping data. And then, because this is expensive work, pursue federal funding, state funding, and other funding sources to continue the effort. As we look forward, we recognize these deficits in our understanding, and it's a key recommendation here is for coordinated below and above water ecological baseline studies. And one thing that's been discussed a lot is not to do surveys just in silos for, excuse me, particular species groups, but to really have coordinated efforts so that you can relate what's happening below water with what's going on above water. So this will include integrated survey design. It's also going to go beyond just regular surveys and include doing individual tracking work with using the MODIS network. These are very small transmitters you can put on birds and bats and pick them up on receivers. Continue to have funding from the state level to support these efforts. Pursue partnerships with our neighbors, and also continue to look for funding elsewhere. Now, because many species are hard to pick up on surveys because they're rare or because of their life histories, there's also a focus on conducting tracking work, including the MODIS work I just mentioned, also GPS tracking studies. This is an example on the left of peregrine falcons that my colleague Chris DeSorbo worked on, captured in down East Maine, and you can see their tracks going across the Gulf of Maine. And these types of data, while you have a small sample size, really can help you understand how different wildlife are using the marine system. Also explore potentially using radar systems, doing bat acoustics, tagging efforts of benthic and pelagic fish, marine mammal surveys, and then utilizing the whale catalog to understand areas of high use of known individuals. The last recommendation, which I won't get into too much, is the Coastal Zone Management Act. And this is the way that the state can engage formally in projects in federal waters. But importantly, this really, you only start to engage at this point when there's actually a proposed project. And there's been a lot of emphasis on the real need at this point is to really help with the siting before you even get into CZMA. And so this is really something that comes later. As we look forward to the work going on now that will be presented to the advisory committee in the spring, is we're looking at best practices around transmission cable routes and landing considerations, considering pre and post construction monitoring, potential mitigation requirements, and then thinking about looking at what New York has done. Could Maine consider procurement requirements? So when there's power purchase agreements for energy that come from the state, that gives the state an opportunity to say how they'd like projects to occur in federal waters, and then also provide input on the research consortium. So I think that is about it, and I'll pass it back.
Thanks, Wing. That's great. A lot of information. And I'm glad you're there, man, helping to manage that stuff. Again, for folks, you're welcome to type your questions into the Q&A. And after we hear from Josh, we'll have a chance to try to go through as many of those as we can. So our final panelist is Josh Rosen. He's an offshore wind consultant now working with the Maine International Trade Center. And he's been participating in a kind of a catch-all working group that's covering supply chain, workforce, ports, and marine transportation. Josh, thanks for being here.
Yeah, Paul, thank you. I am not able to share my screen, so while that's being queued up, I'll just give a quick intro as to why is the Maine International Trade Center involved in conversations about offshore wind. And I'm a co-host now. Thank you very much. And one of the reasons is that when we look to the next decade, offshore wind in the U.S. is expected to be a $70 billion industry, right, within the United States alone. But when we look more broadly and we look forward to the future, industry estimates are that by 2050, 60% of offshore wind installations will be in Asia, 22% will be in Europe, and only about 15% will be here in North America. Secondarily, the domestic offshore wind development that we will see here in the US is largely being driven by European developers. And both of those facts suggest that there's a real place for the Trade Center to play a role in offshore wind, as it's a truly international industry. And that's why we're happy to be part of this conversation. We know that there is huge projected growth in the offshore wind industry, both domestically and abroad. And we think that that provides significant export opportunities for Maine's manufacturers, service providers, researchers, and engineering firms. This working group, which is focused on supply chain, workforce development, and ports and marine transportation, is all about, given that we know this industry will soon be coming to Maine and is growing very rapidly just to our south, what are the ways that we can ensure that benefits from this industry are maximized to Maine firms and Maine people? And so starting with supply chain, I'm not going to go into each of these just because of the time constraints. As others have said, there's more information about each of these on MaineOffshoreWind.org. But the key takeaway with supply chain is that we know today there are 80 firms in Maine that are either already participating in the offshore wind industry or well positioned to. And so a lot of these recommendations are about how do we ensure that those firms can access opportunities that exist today, that can access opportunities that exist in the future, and what role can the state of Maine or its partners play in facilitating those economic opportunities? Moving to workforce development, basically we know when this industry comes to Maine, we're going to need workers, right? We know that we don't currently have the number of workers we need to suit this industry. As you see here, halfway down the slide, our estimates suggest that Maine needs to add about 75,000 new workers to support this industry. Those workers might come from industries currently in Maine. They might come from outside of Maine. But basically, we need to figure out a way to attract new workers to fill these eventual high-paying, high-quality jobs offered by the offshore wind industry. And so the recommendations that you see regarding workforce development are all about how do we ready our K-12 schools, our university system, our community college system, and our apprenticeship program to prepare those Mainers and future Mainers for high-quality jobs offered by the industry. And importantly, it's also about attracting high-quality talent from outside of Maine to move here. Last but not least, because I want to give time for Q&A, the ports piece is basically all about how can we ensure that Maine's deep water ports, we have some of the best deep water port access in the country. How can we ensure that these port facilities can really access opportunities and provide service to the offshore wind industry? What we know is that as of last year, as of 2021, states to our south have already spent more than $2 billion in increasing their port infrastructure to serve offshore wind. We know that states all on the East Coast are competing for this industry, but even despite that, given the continued projected growth of the offshore wind industry, Maine has a real opportunity to engage in this with its ports, to grow our port facilities and the associated economies to really meet the occasion and compete with other states. These recommendations are all about preparing our port facilities, including the Port of Searsport, by pursuing federal funding, by right-sizing our port offerings based on high-quality business data, and most importantly, exploring co-benefits for existing marine uses. What we know is that Maine ports can service not only developments that occur in the future in the Gulf of Maine, but also existing and future developments that occur further to our south. So there's a real opportunity here for our port facilities and to ensure that investments are available for those ports. So as I said, I kind of lightning went through that, but I want to make sure folks have an opportunity for Q&A. Please reach out through MaineOffshoreWind.org. We're excited to hear from you, and we're happy to be a resource, whether through this or through the Maine International Trade Center. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. Really appreciate you being here. And again, folks, the webinar will be recorded, so all of the words that you weren't able to read quickly enough there on those slides, you can revisit those either by reviewing this or the website MaineOffshoreWind.org. and there's a link in your chat that allows you to make a comment and review this stuff. We have several questions that have come in both in the chat and the Q&A, and I'll try to queue these up for our panelists and see if we can get through as many as possible. Robert Ferraro is asking a question about how this is, how the power ends up integrated into the mainland grid eventually, I suppose, under development conditions. Would it be one cable connecting many turbines to shore? And what impact will the cable have on underwater environment and fishing regulations? And finally, what is the impact on shoreside areas where the cable makes landfall? Does anybody want to tackle that one about cabling and transmission?
I'm happy to speak to some of it and then let others jump in as well. So in terms of where cables, so how the electricity is integrated into the mainland grid, it's via transmission cables, which for offshore wind are underwater along the seafloor. There are a variety of ways that they are affixed to the seabed. In the case of floating offshore wind, because the turbines can move to some extent, then there's also a need for a dynamic cable, dynamic being a fancy word for stretchy. Where they make landfall, it generally depends on where the offshore wind is sited and what the most efficient and least impactful, most appropriate route is. But in general, they would make landfall and connect to the grid at some nearshore infrastructure like a large substation. In other states, this can be retired or downsized existing power plant, or it could be new infrastructure that's built to accommodate that.
Anyone else want a piece of that? We have plenty of other questions. Let me go to one in the chat. Are the various study groups in dialogue with Canadian researchers? I know there's another question in here about the networking in the region in New England, and I know that's been mentioned here today. And so if anybody wants to talk about that regional connectivity around monitoring research and policy kind of stuff.
Yeah, I can do an initial reaction, at least from the supply chain side. So the Trade Center has been in active conversations, not only with the UK government, given the MOU signed between Maine and the UK, but also with a number of organizations in Canada, the Maritime provinces in Quebec. Many Canadian firms are well suited to serve the offshore wind industry, and Maine might end up being a gateway for those firms to make access to offshore wind developments in the US. So there is a tremendous international component in addition to a domestic regional component. So I just wanted to add that piece, but others may have contributions as well.
I would say, from the fisheries side of things, offshore wind is pretty new in the Gulf of Maine, and I believe even newer conversations in Atlantic Canada. And so our conversations to date have been largely around fisheries and just collegial normal interactions. And we all kind of roll our eyes and express like, oh my God, wind is coming in, and it is part of the conversations now. So, but I'm not aware of any formal conversations around fisheries between US and Canada with respect to offshore wind.
Meg, I wonder if you can speak to that, because as you pointed out, there's just the migratory nature of many of these species, both in the water and in the air, and they don't know political boundaries.
Yeah, it's true. I would say we've certainly in our conversations talked about coordination and have been coordinating with what's happening to the south of us in the US. So that coordination, ensuring that we're not reinventing the wheel, drawing upon European literature and European knowledge has been very much part of the conversation. That being said, I would say there has not been, that I can recall, a conversation specifically about coordination with Canada. Now, some of our migratory seabirds here certainly are wintering in the Gulf of Maine when they're nesting up in Canada and moving down through the Gulf of Maine. So there's certainly connectivity between those areas and the Gulf of Maine. But as far as a conversation, we haven't really gotten into that. And I think that's a good thing to raise and an area that we could probably improve upon.
Thank you. Here's a good question. Well, they're all good questions, but one from an attendee about the mention that BOEM will be moving ahead with thinking about lease areas in 2024 or soon after. And many of the recommendations all groups have talked about is a need for research and the baseline and so forth. So the question here is, what's the timing on this? How do we get that baseline and some of that research moving soon enough to help inform what could be imminent decision-making around siting? I know that's come up in the fisheries group, Karl, and maybe others.
So the question is, what's the timeline for
how can
data collection or?
Right, and even research that might be novel.
Yeah, so from a kind of a ecosystem and fisheries impact, the state through the legislature and support through this administration appropriated $2 million a year for the Department of Marine Resources to conduct broad research around offshore wind and trying to understand its impacts and trying to mitigate that. So we're hoping to kind of gear that work up in the coming year. And so that's an incredible investment within our department towards new research efforts to better understand what the impacts might be. There is a considerable amount of federal funds being made available too from a variety of sources for new work. I think the reality is some of the leasing conversations may happen faster than the research can be conducted, and so that's where you really pull in the expertise, whether it be on the fishery side, fishermen and researchers and policymakers to try to work with what we've got and try to make the best use of that information as well.
Anyone else want a piece of that?
Jump in a little bit. It's certainly been a conversation in our group too, and this is why we've sort of thought about different phases of how to respond, and that's this mapping effort, which is the first recommendation. Really came forward is we got to get something going right now, but recognize that there are data deficits, and because of that, trying to engage with real expertise in the Gulf of Maine to help update those maps. And then as new data comes in, those maps can be updated. I also, worth thinking about too, sort of the phases of development that could occur in the Gulf of Maine on different scales. So there's, potentially the Monhegan project, which is 1 turbine, the research array, which will be 10 turbines, and then who knows how large a wind energy area would be that comes on a commercial scale. But there's going to be opportunities to iteratively learn through time. I will say one important note, though, is that your baseline data is only going to do a certain job of being able to predict what's going to happen, because when you're putting new structure in the water, that new structure is going to necessarily have wildlife respond to it, and we can't fully predict what those responses will be. And so that's something else that we just have to keep in mind, that even if we had 10 years of the best, highest resolution data we would like to have, it's not necessarily going to fully be able to be predictive of what's going to happen in the future.
Okay, thanks, Wing. Chris Peterson, colleague and friend from College of the Atlantic, has a good question, really targeted both at Wing and Karl, making the point that it makes sense that wildlife and fisheries areas of importance could co-vary in many instances. Are there some important groups or species that might not co-vary for ecological or other reasons and might need more focused research to understand the spatial needs?
I can certainly take a whack of that. Chris, glad you're here. Good to see you. So I'd say the areas where they're going to co-vary the most are when you're thinking about marine bird and high trophic level predators that are focusing on foraging opportunities. So those animals are going to be going to the areas of greatest productivity when they're foraging. However, wildlife are using the Gulf in many different ways. And so when they switch behavioral state to, say, migratory movements, there's going to be less necessarily coordination with below water resources and above. And birds, for example, are going to be making migratory decisions based on geography as much as anything else as they're thinking about how to get south. And particularly as you think about terrestrial migrants, they will not be keying in really much at all on below water features as they're moving forward. And then on the below water side, there's certainly resources such as cold water corals that are not going to necessarily relate to marine bird foraging areas. So while on one level there are areas of covariation, on others there certainly aren't. And that's why there's sort of limitations in what you can do in predictive models. And that's where some individual tracking data comes in, because that's where you're able to understand how birds are moving, say, through the Gulf of Maine during terrestrial movements that might not necessarily be related to these below water factors.
Okay, thanks. There's a whole lot more coming in than we can handle, but I'll take artistic license here and ask a few more. John Waldman has an interesting question about that Maine has a lot of hydro dams. We have the third most, he points out, in the US, many producing little power. How does, I think, the future of offshore wind energy power bode for changing up, I guess, or reopening Maine rivers from the role they play? Maybe that's an Ethan question.
Thanks, Paul. If I understand the question, I mean, I think that I would say that energy markets are competitive markets. And so to the extent that different generators are competing regularly in order to provide energy and the other attributes that are needed to maintain our electricity system, you know, those dynamics, the economics of it are ever changing.
Okay. That question has certainly come up among the fishing industry, and that essentially was part of what Ethan presented earlier in the renewable portfolio across the spectrum. You know, what portion do we expect to get from offshore wind, and how can we rely on other renewable energies while also protecting the planet, right? I think you're answering this, Ethan, yourself, but I want to make it more public question. To what extent will this research look at the economic impact on ports, harbors, and industries? And either you or Josh might touch on that.
Thanks, Paul. I was just starting to type on that, but happy to answer it to everyone. So as part of the roadmap effort, multiple working groups have technical expert consultants that have experience with different aspects of the issues we're looking at around the world. And one of the key pieces of analyses, or several of the analyses that are going on, include socioeconomic impact. So that will include looking at job creation in various parts of the offshore wind industry, including ports and the port build out that will be needed. And so, yes, that is part of the analysis that's ongoing as part of this project.
Okay. We're getting to the end here. I'm going to try to do one more. We got that one. Some of these are probably not answerable today. I guess we touched a little bit on cabling. Here's one about transmission cables in state waters, of course, if they're coming to Maine anyway. How will these be situated to avoid trawling interaction and snag damage? I know we've seen a presentation on how cabling happens and the options for either burying it or covering it. Anybody want to take a quick jab at that?
Sure. As I understand it, the preferred option is to bury the cable at least 6 feet under the sediment floor, and to avoid any ledge or rock outcropping. So they, would kind of snake it through to try to get to the shore in a buried state. If they do have to go over ledge or rocks, then they'll often mattress it. And then there's also the point where it hits the shore. And in some cases, they can do directional drilling So it actually doesn't come up through the intertidal, it actually goes underground and then comes up at a substation or the like. So certainly when the cable is actually laid down, there's a immediate impact to anything in the mud or in the sediment that would be displaced for that cable to come in. But there would also be a recovery, relatively short recovery period where the community would reestablish. There are concerns around electromagnetic forces around cabling, and a lot of those impacts are mitigated the deeper down the cable goes.
Right. Thanks, Karl. And just to clarify, mattressing doesn't mean the mattress from your bed, but there are a series of structures made out of some materials, stone or rubber or something that can be laid on top of these cables, and they kind of look like mattresses. That's probably why that term is used. Correct? Yeah.
Yeah, whatever your sleep number is, that's what they put on the bottom too.
Close enough. We've come to the end of our hour here. I want to thank our panelists today for being here, and thank you to the attendees. I'll remind you that this will be posted on our website at Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries.org, and there's the information right there, probably within a week. So if you want to rewatch it and catch more of the detail that you might have missed, you can do that, or inform friends and colleagues and other people you think ought to see what we did today. Again, thanks to the panelists. We do this every month at Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries. So on April 29th, if you come back, our collaborative management specialist, Mike Tallhauser, will be leading a panel discussion about the recently formed River Herring Network, about the work that we're doing here in Maine, and also the network that's emerging in New England that's restoring some of those sea-run fish, including river herring or alewife, in the rivers here, and the work that they're doing successfully to reconnect the ocean with the fresh water. So you might find that interesting. Find us on April 29th, same time, same place. Again, thanks for being here, and thank you to our panelists, and enjoy the rest of your day.